You won't believe what happened when 9 Hells Angels took a detour to help a stranded grandma. The weatherman's voice crackled through the static. This is not just another winter storm, folks. We're looking at record-breaking winds, deadly frost, and zero visibility across the Appalachian Mountains. But Evelyn May wasn't listening anymore. At 73, she'd weathered enough storms to know when nature meant business. Outside her small wooden house, the world had disappeared into a wall of white fury. She pressed her weathered hands against the frosted window, watching her breath fog the glass. The power flickered once, twice, then held. Barely. Smoke rose weakly from her chimney, a thin gray line quickly swallowed by the howling wind. In moments like these, the isolation hit hardest. No neighbors for miles, no family left to call, just her and the storm that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. The wind screamed through the valley like a banshee, bending trees that had stood for decades, turning snowflakes into bullets of ice that struck her windows with machine gun precision. Her little house groaned under the assault, timbers creaking like the bones of an old woman, which she supposed with a wry smile wasn't far from the truth. The radio had warned of temperatures dropping to 30 below, of whiteout conditions that could kill the unprepared in minutes. She shuffled to her kitchen, the floorboards familiar beneath her slippered feet, and put the kettle on for tea. Samuel always said tea fixed everything that could be fixed, and what couldn't be fixed wasn't worth worrying about. But Samuel had been gone 3 years now, leaving her with his wisdom, his quilts, and a loneliness that felt especially sharp on nights like this. That's when she heard it. Not the wind, not thunder, but something else cutting through the chaos. Engines. Multiple engines, growing louder, struggling against the elements. Her heart quickened as she squinted into the white void, and then she saw them, dark shadows moving like ghosts through the snow, fighting their way up her mountain road that hadn't seen a plow in 2 days. 9 figures emerged from the storm like something out of a nightmare. Leather jackets black as coal, tattoos snaking up frostbitten arms, and patches that made her blood run cold, Hell's Angels gleaming with ice crystals. They were shouting, cursing the storm, cursing their luck, cursing everything as they pushed broken-down Harley-Davidsons through knee-deep snow. Their massive frames battled against nature's fury, but even these giants looked small against the mountain's wrath. Evelyn's grip tightened on the windowsill until her knuckles went white. She'd seen their kind on the evening news, violent, lawless, dangerous men who brought chaos wherever they rode. Images flashed through her mind: bar fights, drug deals, innocent people caught in the crossfire of gang wars. These were the devils her pastor preached about, the wolves that preyed on the innocent and elderly. Her mind raced with every headline she'd ever read, every warning she'd ever heard about what happened when people like her encountered people like them. She stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribcage like a caged bird. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, but the line was dead. The storm had claimed the telephone poles hours ago. No way to call for help, no way to summon the sheriff, no way to do anything but pray they'd pass by her house like a bad dream. "Please, Lord," she whispered, closing her eyes tight, "let them pass by. Let them find someone else's door. Someone stronger. Someone younger. Someone who isn't alone." But God, it seemed, had other plans that night. The largest of the men, their leader by the way the others looked to him, stumbled and collapsed face-first into the snow. His brothers rushed to him, their voices carrying panic she'd never expected to hear from such hardened men. "Mason's down," one of them shouted over the wind. "He's bleeding bad." The concern in their voices was real, raw, human in a way that didn't match the monsters she'd imagined them to be. But monsters could care about their own, couldn't they? Wolves protected their pack. The wind rattled her house like a toy, and for a moment, Evelyn May stood frozen between fear and something else, something her late husband Samuel would have called her fool's compassion. Every instinct, every survival mechanism honed by 7 decades of life, every prejudice born from a lifetime of caution screamed at her to lock the door, turn off the lights, draw the curtains, and pray they'd move on to terrorize someone else. But then she heard it again, that note of genuine panic in their voices as they tried to rouse their fallen leader. And suddenly she wasn't seeing devils in leather. She was seeing what Samuel would have seen: human beings in trouble, caught in a storm that could kill them all before dawn. Samuel had been like that, never could walk past someone in need no matter what they looked like or where they came from. "Evelyn May," he used to say, "the good Lord didn't put conditions on kindness. He just said do it." She could almost hear his voice now, gentle but insistent, reminding her that fear was a poor excuse for turning away from suffering. Instead of backing away from the window, she reached for her shawl. The door flew open with such force it nearly knocked her down. Snow whipped across her face like tiny daggers, and the cold hit her lungs like a physical blow that stole her breath. The wind tried to tear the shawl from her shoulders, and ice immediately began forming on her eyelashes. But her voice, when it came, was steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You men need to get inside," she shouted over the howling wind, her words barely audible above nature's roar. "Now, before you freeze to death out there." They stared at her, this tiny woman in a floral nightgown and wool shawl facing down 9 giants in leather and chains. The leader, blood trickling from his forehead where he'd hit the ground, looked up from the snow with eyes wide with disbelief. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with graying temples and crow's feet that spoke of a life lived hard but not without laughter. For a moment, nobody moved. The bikers looked at each other, then at her, then at their injured leader bleeding into the snow. She could see the calculation in their eyes. Was this a trap? Was the old woman crazy? Was this some kind of setup? But the cold was making the decision for them. Hypothermia didn't care about suspicion or street smarts. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and their leader needed medical attention they couldn't provide in a blizzard. "You sure about this, ma'am?" the red-headed one called out, his voice skeptical but not unkind. "We ain't exactly the kind of company a lady like you usually keeps." "I'm sure that you're going to die if you stay out there," she replied, already stepping aside to let them pass. "And I'm not about to have 9 deaths on my conscience just because I was too scared to do what's right." They began filing toward her door, and what followed was controlled chaos. 9 massive bikers crammed into her small living room, bringing with them the smell of motor oil, wet leather, cigarettes, and something else, the metallic scent of cold and exhaustion. Snow melted into puddles on her hardwood floors that Samuel had polished so carefully. Their boots tracked mud across her carefully maintained home, leaving prints that would take hours to clean. But Evelyn May had not lived 73 years to be intimidated in her own home, not even by men who looked like they could break her in half without thinking about it. She bustled to the kitchen, her slippers making soft sounds on the linoleum, pulling out her largest pot, the one she used for church suppers, and filling it with water. "Soup's what you need," she announced, as if entertaining leather-clad strangers was something she did every Tuesday evening. "Chicken and dumplings. And I've got blankets from my late husband Samuel." He was a big man too, 6'4" and broad as a barn door. The bikers exchanged glances that ranged from suspicious to bewildered. Some of them had removed their wet jackets, revealing arms covered in intricate tattoos that told stories she couldn't read. One had a scar running from his ear to his jawline. Another was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. These were men who'd lived hard lives, seen violence, maybe dealt it themselves. The leader, she'd heard them call him Mason, watched her with sharp green eyes as she ladled steaming soup into mismatched bowls she'd collected over 40 years of marriage. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and there was something in his face that reminded her of the young soldiers she'd seen in old photographs. Too much knowledge, too much pain for someone his age. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice a deep baritone that commanded attention even when he whispered, "You know who we are? What those patches on our jackets mean?" She paused in her serving, looking at him directly for the first time. Up close, his eyes weren't cold or cruel, they were tired. Deeply, bone-weary tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I know you're cold, wet, and bleeding," she replied, handing him a towel that had once been blue but had faded to the color of summer sky. "I know you're far from home in the worst storm we've had in 20 years. That's all I need to know right now." One of the younger bikers, the red-headed giant with a serpent tattoo coiling around his neck, snorted with laughter that held no humor. "Listen to Granny Saint here," he called out, loud enough for the others to hear, his voice carrying the particular cruelty that young men sometimes wielded like weapons. "Acting like we're just lost puppies instead of..." "Instead of what?" Evelyn interrupted, her voice soft but carrying an edge that made Red pause mid-sentence. "Instead of human beings caught in a storm? Instead of sons who have mothers somewhere worrying about them? Instead of men who bleed the same color as everyone else?" She continued serving soup, seemingly unbothered by his mockery, but there was steel in her voice now, the kind that had gotten her through raising 3 children, burying 2 of them, and caring for Samuel through his final illness. "I've lived long enough to know that the hardest hearts usually belong to the most wounded souls," she continued, meeting Red's eyes steadily. "And I've lived long enough to know that even the devil shivers in the cold." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire and the storm's relentless assault on the windows. Something in her words, in the quiet dignity of her response, had shifted the atmosphere like a sudden change in barometric pressure. Red looked down at his soup, suddenly finding the bowl fascinating. The others ate in contemplative silence, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the house felt peaceful instead of tense. Mason cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're grateful. More grateful than you know. But you should understand, we're not just any motorcycle club. The patches we wear, the reputation that comes with them, people have good reason to be afraid." "Maybe," she said, settling into Samuel's old recliner with her own bowl of soup. "But I've learned that reputation and reality don't always match up. My Samuel used to say that you can't judge a book by its cover, but you can usually tell what's inside by how it treats the librarian." One of the bikers, an older man with a full gray beard, chuckled at that. "Your husband sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," she agreed, her voice growing soft with memory. 47 years we were married. He always said I had too much faith in people for my own good. Maybe he was right. But maybe that's not always a bad thing. But peace, Evelyn had learned, was often as fragile as spring ice. As the night wore on and the storm continued its assault, she noticed things that set off quiet alarms in her mind. The way some of them couldn't sit still, constantly checking the windows, the doors. The way one of them, a man with prison tattoos covering his hands, kept something hidden beneath his jacket, his hand never straying far from whatever it was. Most concerning was the youngest of the group, barely out of his teens, who hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived. His eyes held a wildness that reminded her of a cornered animal, and twice she'd caught him staring at her jewelry box on the mantelpiece with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. She said nothing, but she was not naive. Samuel might have believed in the goodness of people, but he'd also taught her to trust her instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling her that while most of these men might be genuinely grateful for her help, not all of them had left their dangerous lives as far behind as she'd hoped. Still, she maintained her gentle demeanor, refilling coffee cups, checking on Mason's head wound, and making sure everyone had enough blankets. Kindness, she'd learned, was sometimes the best defense against violence. It was hard to hurt someone who was taking care of you, someone who saw you as human rather than monster. The storm outside intensified as the night deepened, rattling the house with each gust like a giant's fist pounding on the door. Tree branches, heavy with ice, cracked and fell with sounds like gunshots. The wind found every gap in the old structure's defenses, sending whispers of cold air through the rooms that made the candles she'd lit flicker and dance. They were all trapped together now, predator and prey, savior and saved, or maybe just human beings waiting for dawn. The radio, when it could pick up a signal through the static, warned that the storm was intensifying rather than passing, that roads would be impassable for days, that anyone caught outside faced almost certain death. "Looks like you're stuck with us for a while," Mason said apologetically, though there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely unhappy about the situation. "Hope we're not imposing too much." "Honey," Evelyn replied, pulling Samuel's favorite quilt tighter around her shoulders, "after 47 years of marriage to a man who brought home every stray he found, human and otherwise, 9 more for a few days isn't going to break me." As midnight approached, exhaustion finally began to claim them all. The adrenaline of survival was wearing off, replaced by the bone-deep weariness that comes after genuine fear. The bikers had arranged themselves around her living room like a pack of wolves settling for the night, some on the couch, others on the floor, wrapped in Samuel's old quilts that smelled faintly of the cedar chest where she'd stored them. She'd given Mason the good couch for his head injury, and she noticed how the others unconsciously oriented themselves around him even in sleep. Whatever else they might be, they were loyal to their leader, protective of their wounded. There was something almost touching about it, this fierce brotherhood that had brought them through whatever trials had marked their lives. Evelyn had retreated to her bedroom, but sleep came fitfully. The house groaned and settled around them, a fragile shelter against nature's fury. Every creak, every whistle of wind through the eaves, every settling timber seemed amplified in the darkness. She found herself listening for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps in the hallway, whispered conversations, the soft click of someone going through her things. But the only sounds were natural ones. The storm, the house, the soft snores and sighs of exhausted men finally finding rest. Maybe her fears were unfounded. Maybe these rough angels really were what they seemed, lost souls who'd found unexpected sanctuary. She was just beginning to drift off when the smell hit her. Smoke. Not the clean smell of her fireplace, but something acrid, wrong, poisonous. Her eyes snapped open as her brain processed what her nose was telling her. Carbon monoxide. The chimney had become blocked with snow and debris, and deadly gas was filling her home while they all slept. The silent killer was already doing its work. Her head felt heavy, thoughts sluggish, and when she tried to sit up, the room spun like a carnival ride. But 40 years of nursing Samuel through various illnesses had taught her to recognize the signs, to push through the confusion that came with oxygen deprivation. Moving on pure instinct and muscle memory, she forced herself out of bed, stumbling through the house like a drunk woman. Her legs felt like rubber, her vision blurred at the edges, but she knew what had to be done. Every window in the house needed to be opened, fresh air needed to replace the poison, and she needed to wake 9 men who might already be too far gone to save themselves. The living room was a scene from a nightmare. Bodies sprawled unnaturally, faces slack with the false piece of carbon monoxide poisoning. She threw open the first window, gasping as frigid air rushed in like a slap to the face. The contrast between the deadly warmth inside and the life-giving cold outside was shocking, but it cleared her head enough to keep moving. One by one, she roused the sleeping bikers, dragging them toward fresh air even as her own strength faded with each step. Some came around quickly, coughing and gasping as their bodies remembered how to process oxygen. Others were harder to wake, their systems more compromised by the silent poison. Mason, the leader, was the hardest to rouse. His massive frame was dead weight as she pulled at his arm, and for a terrifying moment she thought she was too late, that the man who'd led his brothers to safety was going to die in her living room because she hadn't noticed the blocked chimney in time. "Come on," she whispered, slapping his face gently, then harder when he didn't respond. "Come on, you stubborn man. Your boys need you. Don't you dare leave them." Finally, blessedly, his eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to alarm as he realized what was happening. But the effort of saving them all had cost Evelyn more than she had to give. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of the floor rushing up to meet her, Mason's voice, desperate and afraid, calling out words that would echo in her dreams. "Don't die on us, ma'am. Please don't die on us." When consciousness returned, it came slowly, like surfacing from deep water. First, the smell of coffee, real coffee, strong and black. Then the sound of movement throughout her house, purposeful and organized. Finally, morning light streaming through clean windows, and the blessed silence that meant the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine white snow. Evelyn found herself in her own bed, covered with every blanket in the house, tucked in with the careful attention usually reserved for children or the very sick. Someone had placed a glass of water on her nightstand, along with 2 aspirin and a note written in careful block letters. "Thank you for our lives." She could hear voices drifting from the kitchen, deep male voices but softer now, different from the rough tones she'd heard the night before. There was laughter, actual laughter, and the sounds of people working together with easy familiarity. Curious and increasingly amazed, she wrapped her robe around herself and ventured out to discover what had become of her unexpected guests. What she found was a transformation that left her speechless. Her kitchen gleamed like something from a magazine. Every surface had been scrubbed clean, every dish washed and put away. The floor that had been tracked with mud the night before now shone with fresh wax. Someone had even organized her spice rack, arranging everything in neat alphabetical order. Through the window she could see more miracles unfolding. Mason was on her roof, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he cleared snow from the chimney and checked for loose shingles. 2 others were fixing a loose board on her porch that had been flapping in the wind for months. Red, the young man who'd mocked her the night before, was carefully sweeping snow from her walkway, his earlier arrogance replaced by focused determination. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, and she realized that someone had not only cleaned her kitchen but had prepared what looked like enough breakfast to feed a small army. Her refrigerator, which had been nearly empty the day before, somehow seemed to have multiplied its contents overnight. "You're awake," Mason said, appearing in her doorway with a steaming mug that bore Samuel's favorite saying, "World's greatest husband." He'd removed his leather vest, and for the first time she could see the tattoos beneath, not the crude gang symbols she'd expected, but something entirely different. Military insignia. Marines. Army Rangers. Navy SEALs. The ink told stories of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood forged in foxholes and desert sands. "We owe you our lives," he continued, setting the coffee on her nightstand with hands that could have crushed the cup but handled it like precious china. "And we owe you the truth." He settled into the chair beside her bed, his massive frame somehow gentle in the small space, like a lion that had chosen to be tame. "We're not active Hell's Angels, ma'am. Haven't been for years. Most of us left that life behind when we started working with veterans, guys like us who came home broken and angry, with more demons than angels watching over them." The story unfolded like a revelation that reframed everything she thought she knew about these men. They'd met in various VA hospitals, support groups, and halfway houses, warriors who'd served their country only to find that coming home was sometimes harder than going to war. The motorcycle club had become their new unit, their new family, a brotherhood built on shared trauma and mutual support rather than criminal enterprise. "We keep the patches because they mean something different to us now," Mason explained, his green eyes distant with memory. "They remind us of who we used to be, and why we chose to become something better. The real Hells Angels aren't too happy about it, but we figure if they want to come after a bunch of broken-down veterans who spend their weekends delivering toys to kids and building ramps for disabled soldiers, they can go right ahead." That's when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. They'd been traveling to a veterans shelter in the next county, their saddlebags loaded with Christmas toys for children whose fathers might never come home from deployments that seemed to never end. Their old Harleys had broken down in the storm, stranding them just when she needed them most, and they needed her. "Funny how God works," Evelyn murmured, and Mason nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen too much coincidence in his life to call it anything but providence. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed. "We were cursing our luck when those bikes died. Now I'm thinking maybe our luck's been better than we knew." Over breakfast, a feast that included pancakes, bacon, eggs, hash browns, and fresh biscuits that rivaled anything she'd ever made, she learned more about each of them. Red, whose real name was Tommy, had lost his leg to an IED in Afghanistan and spent 2 years learning to walk again. The quiet one with the scarred hands was called Bear, a former Marine sniper who hadn't spoken above a whisper since a roadside bomb took out half his unit. The oldest, Jimmy, had been a Navy corpsman who'd seen too many young men die in his arms. Each had a story of service, sacrifice, and survival. Each had come home to find that the skills that kept them alive in war zones didn't translate well to civilian life. Each had found in this unlikely brotherhood something they'd lost when they left the military: purpose, belonging, and the knowledge that someone always had their back. "We're not saints," Mason was careful to point out, seemingly reading her thoughts. "We've all done things we're not proud of, made mistakes that hurt people. But we're trying to do better. Trying to be the kind of men our brothers who didn't make it home would have wanted us to be." The transformation in her house continued throughout the morning. They fixed a leaky faucet that had been dripping for months, replaced burned-out light bulbs she couldn't reach, and even managed to get her old television antenna adjusted so she could pick up more than one channel. It was like having a crew of guardian angels, each one determined to repay her kindness in concrete, practical ways. Before they left, as the morning sun painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the 9 men gathered on her porch like some kind of informal military formation. Mason stepped forward, reaching into his saddlebag to pull out something unexpected: a rose, but not made of petals and stem. This flower had been crafted from metal, welded from parts of their broken motorcycles, each petal hammered with loving care by hands more accustomed to violence than art. The stem was made from a brake cable, the leaves from pieces of chrome, the whole thing polished to a shine that caught the morning light like captured fire. "Ma'am," Mason said, pressing the metal rose into her hands with the solemnity of a military medal ceremony, "if anyone ever harms you or threatens this home, they'll answer to us. That's not just words, that's a promise made in blood and kept in steel." His eyes, gray as storm clouds, held hers with unwavering intensity. "We may look like devils to some folks, but you've shown us what angels do. And angels deserve protection." The others nodded their agreement, and she could see in their faces that this wasn't just Mason's vow but a commitment shared by all of them. These men who'd been strangers 24 hours ago had become something more: guardians, protectors, self-appointed knights in leather armor. Evelyn laughed, a sound like silver bells in the crisp morning air, though tears were running down her cheeks. "You boys are sweet, but I can't imagine anyone bothering an old woman like me. I've got nothing worth stealing and no enemies worth mentioning." "Maybe," Mason replied, "but the world's full of people who think age and kindness make someone an easy target. If they come around here thinking that they're going to get an education they won't forget." But as their engines roared to life and they disappeared down the mountain road in a cloud of exhaust and snow spray, she found herself placing the metal rose in her garden, where it caught the sunlight like a beacon. Something told her their promise was more than mere sentiment, more than the kind of empty words people sometimes offered when they felt obligated to show gratitude. These men had proven themselves capable of transformation, of choosing kindness over cruelty, protection over predation. If they said they'd come when she needed them, she believed they would. The rose became a symbol of that faith, a testament to the idea that even the most unlikely people could become heroes when circumstances demanded it. Years passed like pages turning in a well-worn book. Evelyn grew older, her steps slower, her back more bent, but her spirit remained unbroken. The metal rose became a permanent fixture in her garden, weathering seasons and storms while never losing its shine. Neighbors would sometimes ask about it, this strange flower that bloomed eternal among her more traditional plantings, and she'd smile and say it was a gift from some guardian angels who happened to ride motorcycles. She often wondered about her unexpected protectors, whether they'd found peace, whether they'd continued their work with veterans, whether they remembered an old woman's kindness or if it had faded into just another story from the road. She'd see motorcycles sometimes passing on the highway below, and wonder if any of those distant figures were her boys, still riding, still searching for ways to make amends for whatever darkness they'd left behind. She got her answer on a Tuesday evening in late fall, nearly 3 years after the storm that had changed everything. The man wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than she'd spent on clothes in the last 5 years, and he drove a luxury car that looked absurd on her dirt road, its pristine paint job already dusty from the mountain gravel. He introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, a developer, speaking of progress and opportunity in the smooth, practiced tones of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm and intimidation. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, settling uninvited into one of her porch chairs, "I represent Blackwood Development Corporation. We're planning a luxury resort in this area. 5-star accommodations, world-class spa facilities, championship golf course. This location is absolutely perfect for our needs." He spread out architectural drawings and surveys, pointing to where her little house sat in the middle of what he envisioned as the resort's main entrance. "We're prepared to offer you fair market value for your property, plus a generous relocation bonus. You could buy a nice condo in town, closer to medical facilities and shopping. Much more suitable for someone your age." When she politely declined, explaining that this was her home, the place where she'd buried Samuel, where she planned to spend whatever years God had left for her, his tone changed. The charm evaporated like morning mist, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't think you understand the situation," he said, his voice dropping to the register that powerful men used when they wanted to sound reasonable while making threats. "This project is going forward with or without your cooperation. Property values in this area are about to skyrocket. The tax assessments alone will probably force you out within 2 years." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a cold appraisal of a predator sizing up prey. "But that's the hard way. The easy way is to take our offer and relocate voluntarily. Think about it, you're what, 76? 77? How much longer can you really manage out here all alone? What happens when you fall and break a hip? When you have a medical emergency? Who's going to help you then? This is prime real estate, old woman," he continued, his earlier politeness evaporating completely now that he thought he had her cornered. "Beachfront property in the mountains, if you will. You can sell to us willingly or we can make things very difficult for you. Your choice, but either way this land is going to be ours." 2 more cars arrived as if on cue, disgorging men who looked like they solved problems with their fists rather than their minds. They weren't wearing suits. These were the kind of men Blackwood hired when charm and legal pressure weren't enough. They surrounded her porch with practiced efficiency, their intentions clear without words needing to be spoken. Evelyn's heart raced, but she straightened her spine and met Blackwood's eyes with defiance born of 7 decades of surviving life's storms. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the fear singing in her veins, "this is my home. My husband built this porch with his own hands. I buried him in the cemetery down the road. I'm not leaving and I'm not selling. Not to you, not to anyone." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Mrs. Patterson. But if you want to do this the hard way." He gestured to his men who began moving closer to the porch, their body language shifting from casual intimidation to active threat. That's when she heard it, the distant rumble of engines echoing through the valley like approaching thunder. The sound grew louder, multiplying, until it became a symphony of mechanical music that seemed to shake the very mountains. 9 motorcycles emerged from the tree line like avenging spirits, their riders older now, gray threading through their beards, but still fierce, still loyal, still keeping their promise. Mason dismounted first, his presence filling the space between threat and safety like a wall of living steel. The others fanned out behind him, creating a semicircle of leather and determination that made Blackwood's hired muscle suddenly look very small indeed. Where the developer's men had been predators, these were apex predators, warriors who'd faced death in foreign lands and come home harder than the mountains themselves. "Problem here, Mama May?" Mason asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from leading men through hell and bringing them home. His green eyes swept over the scene, taking in Blackwood's expensive suit, the hired muscle, the architectural drawings scattered on her porch table, and the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Blackwood tried to bluster, talking about property rights and legal procedures, about how this was a private business matter that didn't concern them. But his words died in his throat when Mason stepped closer, and he got a good look at the man he was dealing with. Mason had aged in the years since the storm, but it was the aging of steel in a forge, harder, stronger, more dangerous than before. The military tattoos on his arms told stories of places Blackwood had only seen on maps, of conflicts that had forged boys into men and men into something harder than ordinary mortals could understand. "Son," Mason said softly, his voice carrying the particular menace that came from absolute confidence in one's ability to back up any threat, "you've got about 10 seconds to get off this lady's property before we discuss your manners in terms you'll understand better." "You can't threaten me," Blackwood stammered, but he was already backing toward his car, his hired muscle following suit with the instinctive recognition that they were outmatched. "I'll call the police. I'll have you all arrested." "You do that," Red Tommy called out cheerfully, though there was nothing cheerful about the way his hand rested on something under his jacket. "We'll wait right here. Give Em something to think about while they're driving up that long, winding mountain road." The developer and his men left fast, expensive cars spinning gravel as they fled down the mountain like the cowards they'd always been underneath their expensive clothes and borrowed authority. They left behind only dust and the echo of their retreat, along with scattered papers and the bitter taste of confrontation avoided. The 9 guardians remained until the dust settled, until they were certain the threat had passed and wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Mason walked the perimeter of her property, checking sight lines and escape routes with the professional attention of someone who'd done this kind of security assessment in more dangerous places than the Appalachian Mountains. "They'll be back," he said finally, rejoining her on the porch where she sat in her rocking chair, still clutching the metal rose she'd grabbed from her garden when the trouble started. "Maybe not Blackwood himself, but men like him. That kind doesn't give up easy when there's money involved." "Will you really come if I need you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the way they'd appeared like something out of a prayer, arriving exactly when hope was running out. "Mama may," Mason said, touching the brim of his cap in an old-fashioned gesture of respect that reminded her achingly of Samuel. "We told you we had you covered. That wasn't just talk then, and it isn't just talk now." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Evelyn May stood in her garden, her fingers tracing the petals of her metal flower. The sound of motorcycle engines faded into the distance, but the feeling of protection, of being watched over, remained as constant as the mountain itself. She thought about the men who'd kept their word, who'd traded the easy path of violence and crime for the harder road of redemption and service. They'd chosen to become guardians instead of predators, protectors instead of destroyers. In a world that seemed increasingly full of people like Blackwood, people who saw kindness as weakness and age as vulnerability, it was good to know that there were still others who understood that some things were worth protecting. Sometimes, she reflected as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the fiercest angels wear leather instead of wings. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness creates ripples that last a lifetime, touching lives in ways you never imagine. And sometimes, when you open your door to strangers in a storm, you discover that the monsters you feared were actually the guardians you needed. The metal rose caught the last rays of sunlight, gleaming like a promise kept, a vow honored, a friendship forged in the crucible of a winter storm and tempered by years of mutual respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new reasons to doubt the goodness of human nature. But tonight, Evelyn May Patterson slept peacefully, knowing that somewhere out there, 9 guardian angels rode the highways, keeping watch over those who'd shown them that even devils could find redemption in an act of simple human kindness. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever had your assumptions about someone completely shattered by an unexpected act of kindness? Sometimes the people we're taught to fear are exactly the ones who'll fight the hardest to protect us. Sometimes the gentlest hearts create the fiercest defenders. The metal rose still shines in Evelyn's garden, a reminder that promises kept can weather any storm, and that angels come in all forms, even the ones wearing leather jackets and riding motorcycles. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see the strangers around you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments below. What's the most unexpected act of kindness you've ever witnessed? Have you ever been surprised by someone who turned out to be completely different from your first impression? Subscribe for more stories that prove heroes come in all forms, and remember, sometimes the scariest looking people have the biggest hearts. Sometimes angels have tattoos, and sometimes the devil's just a man who's never been shown grace. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your doors ready. You never know when you might be entertaining angels unaware. or when you might need some guardian angels of your own.